Well, hello and welcome. I'm really excited today that we have A-dae Romero-Briones and Zach Ducheneaux joining us. We're going to talk and get sort of into the wonky details and philosophical ideas surrounding agriculture and land management policy from a Native perspective. I am really excited to hear from you all because I think a lot of our audience doesn't know the experience of being Native in our government's land management paradigms and our agricultural policies and rules, really everything from how we manage our public lands and forests to incentives and rules and financing around agricultural access and production. So really excited to get going with you all. But before we jump into the details, I'm wondering if you can give a little bit of your background. A-dae, I was reading up on you, and you have such an impressive and wide-ranging background. And then I know your personal interests are also really unique. And Zach, obviously, when I found you, it was like finding a diamond in the rough. You're such an incredibly smart and accomplished person. So would you all mind telling our listeners a little bit about who you are, where you're from, and where you see yourselves going? And A-dae, we'll start off with you.
Okay. Um, and thank you. It's an honor to be here. It's always an honor to sit on a panel and have a talk with Zach. Before I became part of this space, I would be an audience member listening to Zach's lectures, and would always say, like, I wanted to learn more about that guy. And so it's always an honor to be with Zach. I am Cochiti and Kiowa, and I live in the homelands of my husband, who's Pomo, and we have two kids in California. And where am I going in the future? Hopefully, I'm like a grandma, and I'm making good food for my grandkids at some point, and just enjoying my family and my tribal community, and just being a good human being in the future. That's where I hope I'm going.
Great.
Zach?
Thank you. Zach?
My name is Zach Ducheneaux. I'm the executive director of the Intertribal Agriculture Council, and I'm a member of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe. We're located on the northern Great Plains alongside the Missouri River. I struggle these days to describe us as within South Dakota, but there we sit. When I first met A-dae, I was a program manager for the Intertribal Agriculture Council, managing our tribal technical assistance network. And that was part of my journey to get here. And I started off this journey with the IAC as a distressed rancher who had a poorly structured finance arrangement with a bank to become the third generation on the ranch. And for a long time, it didn't look like there was going to be any hope of a fourth generation. But by virtue of a upbringing that always inspired learning, and I can't tell you how many times I've heard pay attention. Here I am. I get to be the executive director of the Intertribal Agriculture Council, work with great folks like A-dae over at First Nations. We've created a CDFI. I find myself on a philanthropic board of directors as the vice chairman, and I make a joke about my existence in the world, and it's only about half joking. I've just seemed to stumble ass backwards into good situations, and it's my job to not mess them up for those that are coming behind me. And I think that's a good approach for us to take with the earth as well.
Thank you, Zach. And I should note that A-dae, you are a producer on a recent film called Gather, which is a beautiful example of what it means to be struggling and thriving and relearning and participating in a food system that has been really impacted by colonialism and the culture of our food system that we brought with us in that process. So in addition to all your incredible work as a policy sort of wonk and analyst, you are also in this position of an artist and producer. So thank you for bringing both perspectives today. So I'm coming from, well, I'm sitting on today historical Ute lands in southwestern Colorado. And what I wanted to start out this conversation with is just a little bit of background. I don't think that folks realize what it means to try to be tending land or engaging in agriculture as a Native person today in the United States. I think, we tend to think, oh, everybody has equal access or everybody has kind of the same rights and the same opportunities. And in conversations with you all, it's become very apparent to me that, of course, that is not the case. We really see a difference in sort of the amount of time and effort it takes to be able to do these things that so many other folks really take for granted. So my first question really is, could you give us some illustration about what this looks like, in terms of your own experience farming or accessing and tending land?
Absolutely. And I'll start, I guess. We have a very unique relationship, excuse me, with the federal government and even with our own tribal government. Many of our tribes have land that's held communally to this day and has been since time immemorial. I've mentioned I was the third generation hoping to raise the fourth. We've been here for countless generations being stewards of this land. And in the imposition of a European model of agriculture on this continent, land ownership and property rights have been kind of imposed on our folks. We have what was known as the allotment era, where land was taken from the communal land holdings and given to an individual Indian with a trust title to it. The federal government maintained a relationship as the trustee, and the Indian had the beneficial use of the land. For a period there, that transaction, it was new to Indians to actually have a title to land and own that particular part of land, because prior to that, we were part of the land. We were part of the ecosystem. So now we've got this system where the legal property right is attached to the individual Indian, and the concept of land ownership is a little foreign. We've got a case 3 hours east of here on the Siston-Wahpeton Reservation, where a Native American grandmother lost 2 quarter sections of land over a dental bill and a grocery bill at the local store, because the store owner knew he could extend her the credit and then just go attach her title at the government office. So that was in an era when the government trustee was really trying to steal that land through its agents and its operators. Now we're in an era where the government functions more as a trustee, and they try to look out for the best interest of the Indians. But in that effort, the vision is that the federal government will monitor transactions to ensure that the best interests of the landowners are being upheld. But we exist in an ecosystem of generational underfunding of the trustee. The Bureau of Indian Affairs is expected to do this with 1/3 of the money that is needed to do the job. We know that there's not enough money to do it. We advocate for more funding for the Bureau of Indian Affairs to better do their job, because as the Bureau of Indian Affairs carries out that role as the trustee, tribal organizations, tribal governments can exercise what's known as self-determination contracts to take over those operations. Right now, our tribal governments are just set up for failure if they take them over at the funding level that they're at right now, because it's not funded well enough to do it, never has been. So we've got this circumstance where we've got a landlord, if you will, who has never been funded to do the upkeep of the land, but is tasked with the upkeep of the land. In the interest of realizing an economy of scale, oftentimes vast swaths of these tribal lands were just rented out to non-Indian producers, non-Indian ranchers, all in one chunk. Back in the 1940s, virtually all of the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation was rented out to a couple of big cattle companies from Texas, the Matador, what the heck was the other one? Diamond A Cattle Company. That's a couple million acres rented out to two entities just because it was easier to administer. Since then, tribes have done a really good job of upholding their property right, upholding their right to manage their land. And a lot of organizations have come along through that self-determination era to help tribes exercise those rights and take control of their land. It's an ongoing battle. There's still a significant amount of land out here that is Indian in nature, that isn't controlled by Indians yet, but we're going to get there. Controlled by Indians yet, but we're going to get there.
I'll just add to Zach's comments and just take us one step back further, because I think the concept of a native or Indian land, one is still a very European concept, in that like there are 573 tribes. The number changes, 573 different federally recognized tribes, numerous unrecognized tribes, a lot more informal native communities. And so this idea of having like a native identity, one is developed by our relationship with the federal government, because we're all having to deal with stuff like Indian policy, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and it creates like this universal experience having to deal with this one entity. But in reality, we are many different people, many different nations, many different government structures, so many different languages and cultures. And so if you think about how that translates into land management, it's vast and it's nuanced. And I think that, to me, that is an example of how we want to manage land, in that there's no one all size fits all for whatever land we're talking about. Some are in coastal areas, some are in deserts, some are on the Great Plains, some are in like swampy areas. And so you have so many different management systems that have, and cultures that have developed from the places that we steward. And so first, the idea of having a native pan identity is one that we have to deal with currently, but it is a European concept. And then the second most important part to me is our country was founded with, and economically founded by land. And the foremost goal of colonization and American nation building was to utilize that land to get economic footing so that they could be an independent nation. And of course, we all know the tragic history. First, it was like, get rid of the Indians. And then the next was like, try to enslave them. And then the next one's like, how can we legally do this? How can we legally take land, but control it? So that's kind of the era that we're in now. The federal government can legally control our land, even though we are on it, but really we have very minimal controls over some of those lands. And I think the work of IAC and First Nations, who I work for, are trying to figure that out, along with so many other organizations. But we're still in the era of trying to legally and physically control our own lands. And if anybody is ever in a horrible landlord rental situation, it's the same kind of situation. We have to deal with a landlord that's absent at times. We have to deal with a landlord that doesn't have enough resources, like Zach said, and we have to deal with a landlord that sometimes has totally opposite interests of our communities. And it's not only is it complicated, it's stressful, and it creates generational behaviors that we are now having to sometimes correct, because we have to deal with not controlling our own lands, which is really hard. And the last thing I'll add is that when we think about private property and land ownership, one of the universal characteristics of tribal communities, whether they were sedentary or whether they were more like the plains, like hunters, you know, really like understanding the land capacity of your stewarded area was critical. And it took us generations upon generations to figure out what those land capacities are. And so sometimes it doesn't mean staying in one place on even 160 acres, which were given an allotment. Sometimes it means that you have to move. Sometimes you have to follow the buffalo. Sometimes you have to follow the fish. But all those behaviors are based on this idea that you understand the land capacity of the place that you are living. And I think sometimes that's absent in how we conceptually think about private property, because, you know, we have the depletion of soil, we have desertification, like, and it speaks to the value of, or not valuing, the understanding of how much capacity your land can hold.
I'm really glad that you brought that up. And I just want to first acknowledge, you know, two things that I really want our audience to think about, which is one, that this construct of private property is a construct. It's a type of cultural agreement that is enforced through the government, and that it was not the type of agreement that folks who are living in North America, folks on Turtle Island, had in their own societies. So just to really emphasize that, you know, we heard Zach talk about it, heard you talk about it. The other thing that I just want to acknowledge you saying is that this concept of native as a pan concept is indeed also not the case. And I think that's really important. It's not just like, oh, there's Native Americans. There are hundreds of tribes, many of which I know are not federally recognized, many of which may have forgotten their names or were part of multiple areas. There's a vast wealth of cultures here that I just really appreciate you bringing that up, and thank you for like helping us. I think that's a good basis to come at this from, to understand where you both today are coming from. I'm also really glad you brought up this, you know, this history of continually kind of taking away land, you know, like, oh, you guys can have everything west of the Mississippi. Oh, just kidding, you can have an allotment of this many acres. Oh, actually, you know what? We're going to use our financial system. And I know there were many tribes who were put in debt, and then, you know, land was taken, like that example that Zach said. It's happened repeatedly in the history. So, and then now where we're facing today of lack of access to equity, lack of access to food or capital, which further means that those rights are being degraded. So just kind of this long history of degradation of those land rights, which is really the ability to be healthy and to be prosperous. So I just want folks who are listening to understand that. And, you know, there's a lot of resources out there. You can go learn about this stuff. You can read about it. The land grant universities actually is a great example, right? Those big institutions in the United States that are our agricultural support system from the public side sector, from the government, were founded on taking and, again, stealing native land, capitalizing on that, and founding these institutions. Just really ironic when you think about everything that we're talking about today. So there's all that history. And now I want to kind of jump into, Adae, what you were talking about, and what I know Zach talks about a lot too, is the Western approach, or the American government's approach to regulating or incentivizing agriculture has largely been on a very prescriptive basis, right? Like, let's say, you know, these are the commodity crops you can grow: corn, soy, beef, you know, milk. This is what organic means. And you have to meet a standard and you have to pass that test. Or even today, we see in the regenerative ag movement in California, there are 36 qualified healthy soil practices. So there's just across the spectrum of agriculture, there are a lot of prescriptive policies. And they don't answer that thing you were talking about, which is all the ways in which a landscape is different, and all the ways that people are different, and the plants and animals are different. And really what we see is successful is a long-term relationship with that land. That's what you were talking about, right? Generations of folks. So I'm curious from you all, knowing that one size doesn't fit all, and that we've got to move out of this place. You know, Zach, I've heard you talk about how you support the farmer and all that other stuff falls in place. So I'm curious from you guys, what are the types of policies kind of our wonky policy folks should be thinking about when it comes to supporting that relationship instead of these prescribed practices? And Zach, maybe you can start us off.
Sure. And feel free to cut me off because I can literally go on for 3 days about this part. But it's what I'm really passionate about. And it's because of my lived experience and the experience I've got to be a part of for so many other producers all across the country, from California to Maine. I've literally sat at kitchen tables with producers talking about their financial plight. And our assertion that if we can set the producer into a proper economic situation where he's not stressed and not always wondering about whether or not he's going to be there 3 years down the road, he can start to do some 3-year planning. Currently, one of the numbers that I picked out of the internet the other day was $18,000 a year is the average chemical and fertilizer expenditure of a producer.
Wow.
So they're spending that out of their own pocket. And this finance system that we exist in supports that type of expenditure. But that producer can't go and find, say, that same capital to convert to a cover crop rotation within their production. They've got to go to the NRCS to do it. They've got to find a philanthropist that wants to invest, or they've got to work an off-farm job to do that type of thing. It's our assertion that if we can treat this more like a long-term investment, and when we started our CDFI, we said, hey, let's do this like Indians would do. And really it is capitalism, and it's pure capitalism. It's about deploying the capital, giving it time to grow, and sharing in the growth of the capital. What we have now in this country isn't capitalism, it's greed trying to fit the cloak of capitalism around it so nobody can see it. But we're starting to see through it more and more. And that's really what I think we need to be echoing, is that there's enough capital in this system if we equitably and properly distribute it to have these things start to happen. This producer, if he can liberate some of his production income out of the hands of the bank into his working capital fund, can do these things. He doesn't need to wait for the NRCS or wait for the IAC or First Nations to go beg, borrow, or steal money from somebody to get to him in a program. They have the capacity to do that from their own production income. And the benefits that we'll see will start to manifest themselves over time. And then we can really start to think about that 7th generation that's coming after us.
And Zach, I remember in reading your work that you talk about the way to do that to make it more long-term is to defer that interest, principal payment, right? So you talking about government-based or private-based investments that defer your principal, right? Because we know that the agricultural production matures over time. And, one of the big challenges right now is that everybody just wants to get in and get out, right? It's that kind of that greed mentality of what's my quarterly profit or what's this rate of return. And, I know a lot of folks go under. Farmers are the most over leveraged from a debt perspective in the United States of any of the population. So I think this idea is really powerful that you have, which is let's defer that principal payment and allow the investment to mature and allow these folks the time to really dial it in, to figure it out, to have access to that capital that you were saying they don't have access to under the current paradigm. Am I getting this right, kind of from your perspective?
Yeah. Yep. And in any working capital relationship where you're borrowing that working capital or that chattel debt, before the end of the first production year, you have to give some of the actual capital back. It's not just the interest you give back damn near 20% of the capital that they gave you to start with. So that literally never gets to take hold and grow. It would be the equivalent of planting a perennial crop, harvesting the crop, and then tilling the land again to plant a perennial crop next year. You never realize the benefit of the perennial nature of the crop. And if we get the capital deployed out there, and this, it's based on an artificial linkage between the useful life of an asset, an individual asset, as opposed to the holistic plan for that asset. I use cows a lot because that's what I'm familiar with, but this can work for buffalo or seed stock or anything like that. When a producer borrows money to buy cows, the bank tries to get them into a 3 or 4 year note. If the producer is lucky and savvy and has a sympathetic bank loan officer, they can get a 5-year note on those cows. That $100,000 to buy those cows costs them $23,000 at the end of the first year. What ends up happening is that producer has to sell so many of the units of production that they don't get to maintain the value of their assets. So at the end of 4 or 5 years, they end up with an aged cow herd, and they've got to go back and borrow more money. So the producer is now on this endless treadmill of debt that's ever increasing. And in our model, we shift that into a long-term investment based on the producer and their plan. Rewind.
So you're investing, so in other words, you're investing in a Keepton, which is your CDFI.
Yep.
You're investing in the producer and not in the asset. So not
Yes.
that 4-year lifetime of the cow, but in the lifetime and learning and plan of that producer. Is that right?
Yeah, and we believe it's a flawed methodology to link capital to the asset, the useful life of the asset, because that useful life of the asset is arrived at by taking the IRS depreciation schedule. And that's just designed to keep the capital of well-to-do people in their own pocket by having them not pay an income tax on it. So we're shifting the paradigm, and we're going to invest in the producer and his holistic plan. Their plan is going to include retaining more heifers, developing a grass-fed product as opposed to that commodity-fed product, maybe putting in that own fence from their own production instead of waiting 2 years for the NRCS to get them the money. And it's a fundamentally different approach, but we're reaping a return on that. There's a lot of value in this system if we don't get greedy as participants in it. And right now, the corporate interests, whether they be banking or big food, are greedy. And they're trying to keep that shroud between the producer and the consumer, so one doesn't know what the other's doing. Because heaven forbid, the consumer might say, hey, I think I'd rather put my savings account in Akiptan so I can invest in this producer and help him do better for the product that I'm going to want to eat. So it's a, you know, in the 70s, we stopped having a virtuous circle of corporatehood because Milton Friedman decided, hey, it's about the shareholders and quarterly earnings, like you said. We stopped that virtuous circle where we reinvest corporate profits in that industry, and the producers are on the short end of that stick, as are the consumers.
And I would just add here that what Zach is fundamentally talking about is, and what he's challenging is very much a pedagogy and a cycle of finance that doesn't jive well with how Indigenous people see the world. One, it rests on the idea that just take the concept of depreciation, for example, right? Mm-hmm. Like that is so antithetic to Indigenous way of thinking. Like the idea for us, like there's a concept of like taking care of land and things for 7 generations, right? There's no depreciation. Like in reality, like as Indigenous people, our obligation is to ensure that our land and our resources are even better in 7 years rather than being depreciated to 0 at some point. And the other concept that, you know, that Zach hit on was that when we think about corporations, right, when you have a corporate entity, which is like legally considered a person, but then only accountable to shareholders. Like when, and we see this in the environmental field or even in large agricultural corporations, when they take all the water or when they deplete the soil, like nobody is accountable. You can take the corporate entity to court, but really it's gonna probably end up as a monetary remediation, but who's gonna clean that up? Who's gonna make sure the soil, like there's no accountability when everything has to run through a corporate structure, which is the way it's designed. And in an indigenous community, like we are all accountable to our people, to our lands, and to our children who may not even be born. Like that accountability is real. And those things don't exist in a financial system that currently rests within agriculture. And I think the one other thing that I would say that Zach is really pointing out is indigenous people, when we started off talking about the history, when we think about indigenous people in this structure that we're currently in, capitalism in America, there's no doubt in my mind that indigenous people have the savvy to figure it out. People like Zach know the nuances and the details and can figure it out. And really, when we think about how long we've been participating in capitalism, it hasn't been that long. Like we got our first probably store in Cochiti, like in the 1940s, and it was owned by a white person. And now we have businesses. You know, it's been less than 100 years that we participated in capitalism. So, and when we go back to this idea that Native people are vastly different, there are some tribes who are very good capitalists and probably can challenge the whole system. And there are some tribes who choose not to participate in capitalism and want to go to a more traditional structure. But the whole thing is like in Indian country, in Native America, like we need all these systems to work together in order to ensure that like we can eventually and optimally manage our lands to the point where we are taking care of our own people, our own kids, and you know, putting health and happiness back into not only our lands but our people.
Adae, it makes me so full of joy and like optimism when to hear you talk about it. And you know, I definitely, when I first read some of Zach's writing, I, as a political economist, was like, that he's got to figure it out. He understands not how to take advantage of the system for himself, but how to make the system work for everybody. Like he got it. And I just want to recognize that 100%, I think about like, you know, what's possible if we shift this idea of depreciation to appreciation. You know, what's possible if we think about the long term instead of greed in the short term, but like the compounding benefits of accountability and abundance and true restoration. And what does that look like applied to capitalism? You know, I also have spent a long time both growing up close to some of the tribes near where my grandparents lived in Montana, but also studying like natural capitalism theory of like long-term investments and appreciation and how you get these systems thriving. So I think, you know, from that wonky side of me, I get really excited. But I want to make sure that I get to a question that one of our nerds asked and wanted me to ask you, Adae. And what she asked was, in this film Gather, which is beautiful and which you've produced, there's this idea of a restorative revolution. So can you talk to us and help her understand, what does a restorative revolution look like, you know, to you when you say that or when you hear
that? And you know, the image that comes to mind when people say restorative revolution, and really that's a term coined by Sammy Gentsov of the Yurok Nation. And when I think of him fishing on the Klamath River, able to get fish. Like he's getting healthy fish out of that river. And when I think about how it applies to me, I think of me talking to my grandkids in my own language, you know, and there's so many reasons why that hasn't happened. And we can go through all the reasons in policy. It has to do with food. It has to do with land management. It has to deal with how our people deal with one another. And all of those have been interrupted by very deliberate policies, by very deliberate actions by society to remove us from those cultural anchors that tie us to our lands and foods and people. And so when we say restorative revolution, I just imagine like indigenous people being in a community where our language is healthy, where our lands are healthy, where our waters are healthy. And then when I apply it to people outside the indigenous community, you know, it's nuanced because I think of like regeneration, right? So I think there's a lot of potential in the regenerative agriculture movement. I think there's a lot of potential for it to be restorative and to be able to create these carbon sinks or to create ways to actually restore some of the damage that agriculture has raged on some of our most precious and fertile lands. I imagine there are ways that we can figure out ways to grow our food and that makes our waters healthy and less polluted with pesticides. When we talk about the restorative revolution, we're talking about creating like a healthy place for everyone. And so one of the most interesting conversations I ever had was with somebody who was really interested in microbiome of plants and soil. And he was so excited about telling me about what kind of microbiome were on certain plants and where we're on certain grasses. And you know, I was like, oh my gosh, you remind me of my grandma who always told me like plants have spirits, plants have energies and life. And it's the same concept that there are healthy, natural spirits of the plants, whether you want to call them spirits or microbiome, that need to be restored in order for these cycles to regenerate and to restore their natural abundancy. And really that's what we're talking about when we're talking about restorative revolution, like taking care of our lands for 7 generations, if not 10 or 12 generations beyond us.
I like this because as you say revolution, I see the cycle. So what's a restorative revolution is like, what's our relationship to these cycles of life, you know, to carbon cycles, to water cycles, to nutrients. And so I kind of just, I like that sort of image you just gave us so beautifully of like, how do we engage in a restorative revolution, which is to restore the cycle and those cycles that support all of us. So thank you so much for that. And Zach, I see you might have something you wanna add there.
Just applause for A-dae. That's a great way to explain it. And there's a video that I used to show when I was trying to inspire the next generation of youth at our events, and it's Derek Sievers on YouTube talking about a first follower.
Oh yeah.
They're all on the hillside, and there's one guy
Right.
just gets up, starts dancing to the festival music, and pretty quick the whole hillside's dancing. And I feel like that's where we're getting to where it's not just Ross Racine and Janie Hip and others that were there before me dancing on that hillside. I jumped up there and started dancing with them, and now there's folks dancing alongside all of us. And A-dae's got the same deal at her organization. And what we've got to do now is get some of those folks that are still wondering what the hell we're dancing about on our side, because we're not going to have any meaningful climate change impact unless we get the 2 million farmers and ranchers enlisted in this. And we've got to find a way to speak in terms of regenerative agriculture and soil health and the long-term benefits that resonate with them. Because one of the things that needs to be restored is that relationship that exists not only between rural and urban folks, but people of color and people that aren't of color. Restorative is a holistic term. And I really like that. And I'm going to probably steal it and give credit to Sammy and you, A-dae. I like that concept. And we're going to start to incorporate that into our culture and continue dancing on that hillside so that more folks can join and see what we're up to.
Well, I certainly will follow your dance leads, and then, you know, hopefully some of the folks that I work with will see those dance moves and they can dance too. You know, I think it's interesting. One of the things I notice with folks that I work with a lot is they tend to get fixated on like one thing, you know, like, oh, it's this thing, you know, and really what I hear both of you saying is it's participating in a certain way, but it's you doing it where you are, you know, like Adae, when you say, to me, it looks like speaking to my grandchildren in my own language, you know, or, you know, and Zach, when you talk about supporting farmers where they are to do their best. So it's not everybody doing the same thing. It's like this, it's like people are all in cycles, but where they are and participating in those things. And you know, I really respect and often find so much relief in learning a little bit about native languages because of just the amount of words that we have for one thing, like the amount of words for snow, or the amount of words for the way wind moves through grass, or the amount of words for like the way a spring can take place, and just understanding that like there are so many ways for this thing to happen. And I think that's sort of like a freedom that a lot of the cultural mindset I work with doesn't really have. They kind of think like, to be right, it has to look just like this. It has to look like this everywhere, you know, versus, well, there are 50 words for snow, you know, and it's like, that's a different whole way of being in the world. And I really appreciate both of you and the people you work with and people you are in native landscapes that understand that and that help bring that understanding, you know, outwards to us. So we're in this funny spot where we want to work in these holistic cycles, but we got the US Farm Bill. And you know, we got these really big clunky policies. We got the Bureau of Land Management. We have national forests. And all of these are huge ways in which the federal government really dictates the way that we interact with land, especially in many cases, the way Native folks interact with land. But I will just say, Adae, thinking about what you were saying about having the federal government as your landlord, I can think of a lot of folks where I live who would not be okay with that. Like, I don't think anybody wants the federal government as their landlord, you know? So I kind of want to bring it back into this practical question of how do we go from where we are right now to where we want to get to, and what do those like steps look like? So the Farm Bill's coming up. What do we want to see that shift to take us to the next place? You know, if we get to redo the way we interact with, or the way tribes interact with Bureau of Land Management lands, you know, what would it look like to open up those lands for gathering, for tending, for cultivation from a Native perspective? And how do we approach these things from a policy perspective? And how can the communities that I work with in regenerative agriculture kind of understand what your goals are, you know, in those areas, so that we might be able to kind of come together around these new ideas of how to shift these clunky things like the Farm Bill. I don't know if that makes sense, but kind of like, how do we bring this vision into the practical next steps of these kind of big institutions that we're dealing with?
Well, one, Calla, I want to say, you know, in my community in Cochiti, we have 32 different ways of talking about rain and rain clouds, just to like add to that point. And the second point is your idea of like prescriptive correctness or prescriptive success in a lot of these fields is a real one. I think one of the key components, like Indigenous communities always proposes, like everybody has different skill sets. Like nobody has the same way of looking at the world, even if we're born in the same culture. Like everybody has a skill set, but you're valued if you use that skill set to contribute to the community. Like that is the standard. It's not what is your skill set and how good at it are you at it. It's like, are you using that skill set to contribute to the betterment of your community? And when we think about California and I don't know, the 126 different microclimates in California, they were all healthy at one point because Indigenous people maintained that microclimate and then traded with other peoples in other microclimates. And so really like the idea that there's a prescriptive success, I think is one that should be challenged for sure. And talking about the Farm Bill, I'm going to let Zach take the first stab at that clunky mess.
I appreciate that, Adae. And I really like the point that Adae left that with, though, that we had all of these microclimates, which were microeconomies, and there was a macroeconomy functioning on this continent before the Europeans ever got here. There's evidence of trade from Alaska all the way down to Florida. You know, so that things were happening here, and things were happening in a way that worked here. And I think one of the most critical components of why we're losing our languages is because our languages are the epitome of a description of our culture, of our way of life. And when you eliminate the way of life that you're using a language to describe, when you take away the ability to engage in that way of life, the language starts to erode and die. And the language is just the vocal expression of what we were evolved, the way we were evolved to live. And if we bring back that culture, that language is going to start to grow again. And we'll start to be able to describe those things with that nuance and that subtlety. And part of that is understanding what our culture was. We were part of the earth. We didn't own the earth. We felt that there was a kinship between us and all creatures. Even the Europeans, when they got here, we felt a kinship because they were living beings on the earth. They had a different paradigm that they were trying to exercise, one of dominion and control of the earth given by a creator. Ours was different. Our creator created us as part of this to nurture and care for. You know, the Native Americans on the plains were hunters, very sure. They were herdsmen and stockmen as well. And as we move towards our culture, what we're going to realize is some of the things that we did and the animals that we did them with need our help as well. Mm-hmm. You think about the salmon in the Northwest that are trying to operate through these dams. They can't get there. They can't be what they were evolved to be. Now shift over to the plains and think about the buffalo. The buffalo is the perfect representation of the reservation Indian. We take them, we confine them inside this artificial boundary that's not theirs, and we say, hey, fix the ecosystem, and wonder why the hell it don't work. Well, you took out the human. Managed the buffalo. And what we need to do as Plains Indians, as fishery managers, we need to help rebuild the ability of that buffalo to behave like a buffalo. You go to any buffalo ranch in the country right now, they act like a deer. You go to a lot of our reservation communities, our inner city communities, our youth don't act like our culture. Our youth are borrowing from the Black culture, which is borrowing from what they remember from the African continent. And as we start to get back to our way of life, we're going to start to behave like the managers of this ecosystem and enable the buffalo to act more like the herd grazing animal that it is. And you know, there are journals from one of the old Spanish padres that was over here talking about walking through these huge herds of buffalo, literally having to move them out of the way. Before my people had the horse where we could harvest the buffalo at a gallop, we herded them over cliffs. You could line up every Indian in the United States of America around my tribe's herd of 400, 500, 600 buffalo, and you're going to have more dead Indians than dead buffalo, because the buffalo don't behave like that docile herd animal used to. And think about the health benefits of buffalo. I know Elsie is in the Gather movie, and my heart's really with that family right now in the work that they've done on quantifying the nutritional value of buffalo versus beef. Mm-hmm. Imagine if the buffalo was able to act like it was supposed to. Mm-hmm. The buffalo is always agitated when it's around a person. Anybody that's ever hunted knows you want to take your animal without stress because it adds to the value of the product. Mm-hmm. So we've got to start getting back to our culture so that we can help the buffalo get back to his culture and the salmon get back to their culture and unleash our ancestral corn so that it's got all the beautiful colors and nutrients in it instead of having this homogenized food system.
And Zach, I guess I really hear you. And what I see when you're talking is I see a lot of fences on land.
Mhm.
And I see a lot of, that private property construct.
Yep.
And I also see these vast Bureau of Land Management lands that are just abandoned.
Yep.
And what we know from an ecological viewpoint is the landscape is not going to survive climate change without human care. We need to be actively supporting and managing that system and the animals in that system if they're going to survive what we're dealing with right now with climate change, and also if we're going to restore these relationships. So in my mind, I kind of go towards something more radical, which is like, what would it look like for the Farm Bill, instead of funding fences, to fund fences coming down and cooperative property ownerships or agreements so that animals could move in greater distances? What would it look like for Bureau of Land Management to open up for native management of those lands? And I guess, some people might say that's pretty radical, but I actually think we basically did the opposite before. I don't see why we can't say, like, hey, given what we know now, given what the knowledge that these folks have that they've maintained, like, I don't see why we can't have that conversation. And I think that it's important for us to have these sort of more radical conversations about how the government is structuring the way we utilize land and how we can have them deconstruct those structures and reconstruct a better situation. So just curious about your thoughts when it comes to opening up BLM, opening up forest areas. I know a lot of folks in my community too, who are white, are foresters or hunters. And, certainly our public lands are open to oil and gas drilling. So I don't know why they can't be open to good benefits for the land as well. And I know there's folks, both native and non-native, who would be participating in those things. So I'm just curious, like, if the new administration comes in and they want to get serious about this, what do we want them to know about how to help make that happen?
Before we answer that question, I just want to say it's not a radical idea. Like, I don't think you should call that idea radical at all. When we talk about, we've talked about the land, and we talked about how the Morrell Act actually funded universities to create agriculture extension agencies that then went out and like tried to indoctrinate indigenous people to practice American agriculture with American practices. And one of the first things they did in the 1940s was, like, in my community, Pueblos, we've been practicing agriculture for generations upon generations. One of the first things the agriculture extension agent did in my community was come and buy us miles and miles and miles of fences, because they said that, the Pueblos, you have like all these fields, but you really need to like fence them in so that the deer and the elk cannot get to the product. And so the Pueblo farmers who have been doing this for generations in this valley, in the Rio Grande Valley, were like, what do we do with these fences? And it sat on our lands for about 100 years. It's probably still there, actually, because they're like, this just doesn't make sense to us. Why would we fence in our... And then so, like, when the extension agent asked my grandpa, for example, like, why are you not putting up the fence? The elk are eating your corn. And my grandpa's response was like, I am a farmer. Like, it doesn't mean I just feed my people. Like, I feed everything that's around me. And if the elk are coming and eating all my corn, I need to figure out how to make the planting so that they eat some and that my people eat some. It's not like we keep them out, because that just totally messes up the whole cycle of how this valley works. And so there's ways to like plant our fields in ways that allow both the animals and the people to have food. But the issue with climate change now is that some of the indigenous islands of land between Bureau of Land Management and the US Forest Service, who like don't spray pesticides, indigenous people don't spray pesticides. And so there are these like biodiverse islands. And what we're finding is like all this wildlife is kind of like coming and migrating to indigenous lands because they're well cared for. And that's causing problems. But it's not because of the way we farm and not because we lack fences. It's because other people around us are not taking care of their lands properly. And so like speaking to Bureau of Land Management and US Forest Service, like I really think there's a huge learning curve there. They're, you know, like US Forest Service, for example, is only learning now that, you know, it's not good to spray DDT on some of these like lower growth plants that they don't want in these forests. Like it took a long time to do that, right? Yeah, I mean, it's like a more recent behavior that they're learning about. And so really, I think Bureau of Land Management, US Forest Service, Bureau of Reclamation, Army Corps of Engineers, the National Park Service, I mean, all of these entities that sit around indigenous lands really need to figure out how to interact with one another because they don't interact with one another. They create policies and separate documents on how to interact with indigenous communities. They're all separate, so they all have their own statements. And it's like, okay, so that's not on indigenous people, that's not on Indian nations. That's something the federal agencies have to work out, not just for the benefit of indigenous people, but for the benefit of the public. Like how they have their conversations or how they interact shouldn't be like a formal agreement or take an act of Congress. Like that is something that should be happening on a daily basis because it affects all our resources. Like literally one agency will give out a permit and the other agency doesn't know. And you know, it's creating havoc. It's not just in indigenous nations, even though it's very burdensome for my tribe to have to deal with 9 different federal agencies if we want to hunt a deer. It's damaging to like how our whole government operates. And you know, like we're dealing with some very serious issues in our environment. And at the very least, like the human ones should be the least, to me, should be the least problematic, but right now they're the most problematic.
Yeah, I think our, you know, the current culture of Western society or American society is all behind their own fences. You know, it's not, we didn't just fence the land, like that's just an extension of the cultural mindset of how you get to operate, which is in and of itself not just dominant on other cultures, but dominant on our people too, because it's like, no, you only get to operate in this little box. You got to put up a fence, keep people out, and you got to stay inside your fence. And that mindset, you know, it plays out in the government, it plays out in corporate relationships with each other, it plays out in neighbors' relationships with each other, and it really visibly plays out on the land in real visible ways. And, you know, I'm in the same boat as you. Oftentimes we have to pass a law just to get the agencies to talk to each other, which is just crazy. But I do think that in this time where we have these really drastic shifts happening in our environment and socially, there's an opportunity to come and say like, hey, let's do this differently. You know, what does it look like for the American public to invest in our ag producers and to defer that principal investment, to make it a long-term investment? And they're going to get that money back. We're going to get that money back, but we're going to leave it there so that folks can really utilize it to do, you know, what Zach's talking about, to invest in their operations, invest in the land. And also, what does it look like if we had indigenous leadership within the government, or, you know, even without the government or through extension, to say like, let's redo these structures. You know, we built them, we can unbuild them. I think that that's the empowerment piece that folks forget about. So, you know, just in getting this new administration, or people maybe who are part of the next administration, to think outside of their fences. You know, how do we, that's what I want to see. I want to see people being like, listen, public lands, the forests are not going to survive. They're going to burn unless we get in there and proactively do burning or gathering or clearing, you know, or some harvesting of trees. These prairie lands, they're losing carbon, they're oxidizing, they're getting hotter and drier. if we don't get in there and manage grazing in a good way, if we don't get in there and restore those riparian zones, they're toast. You know, they're desert land. So I'm just kind of curious, Zach, from your perspective. I know a lot of this for you is couched in the way finance is done, because that's the thing that makes people able, you know, to go do this stuff. I'm curious from you though, Zach, also, what would it look like if we had those financial reforms, which are actually, like, frankly, pretty straightforward, and a new administration should just go ahead and do them? What would it also look like to open up land access, or the ways in which land can be accessed, you know, whether it's federally managed or native managed?
We've got some brothers and sisters up there at the Kuduk Nation in Northern California that have been trying to tell California how to keep your forest from burning.
Mm-hmm.
They say, we've been doing it for thousands and thousands of years. Let us show you, let us manage this forest that's frankly ours ancestrally anyway. So being able to give control to that, they maintain the knowledge to do that. California wouldn't be on fire every year if the natives were managing it. And that's, so again, we got to talk about that. I love the term restorative revolution. We got to restore that relationship, restore the awareness of the knowledge that existed here before. Our people were researchers, they were scientists, they were biologists, they probably even had a head for finance, because we had to, on a daily basis, we lived these things. And this is going to be a long way around, but you think about the life of an indigenous person on this continent pre-Columbus. Our 13-year-olds knew more about soil science, biology, risk management, and any other science that's tied to agriculture now than our PhDs do in our university systems, because they lived it every single day. And we're not in that reality anymore. So we're learning the agriculture science of the colonizers and trying to find our way to almost overcome that, to get back to our way of doing things. So there's going to be a significant policy initiative that's going to have to support changing the way we do things, changing the management practices. On day one, the Biden-Harris administration could defer all principal payments across the entire spectrum of the federal government for 2 years. We would have proof of concept. We're proving it with our little CDFI, but this would prove it across all spectrums. Our wastewater facilities, our broadband facilities, anything that's got to do with community facilities and rural development, defer the principal payment. The taxpayer will still get its rate of return. In fact, in many cases, it's going to preserve a better rate of return than something that's negotiated at today's interest rates. But what that'll do is be a zero cost stimulus package, because the deferred principal is going to get spent in those communities. That farmer or rancher is going to go buy feed for the next year, going to put a plan in place to get to that next production cycle. Imagine if he's got 2 that he can do it with. The community facilities the community facility that's trying to find a way to pay back that rural development loan is going to have some money to pay their staff to keep things up. Mm-hmm. It's a zero cost stimulus. The money's already out there. We're just going to leave it there for a little bit. And we're going to continue to get that taxpayer's rate of return that was set out by that federal policy. Then we'll have some ammunition for in 2023 when we try to really reimagine this, maybe through some pilot programs at the Farm Bill level, or maybe we've made enough progress. But a pilot program where an entity like First Nations or the IAC or Occupton can manage the taxpayer dollar directly, administer that program, instead of having it go into the federal bureaucracy where the people are distant from our places. We know our communities, and we have a different approach to working with our communities that's based on a long-term relationship instead of that short-term window of opportunity that financiers tend to capitalize on. So one of the successes we had in the 2018 Farm Bill was in the food distribution program. It's the Native American SNAP program, if you will, to put it in terms that the rest of the nerds for Earth can understand. And it's administered at the local tribal government level. And it is the way it works now. Federal taxpayer dollars go to support this obligation to our people to help feed our people based on the theft of all of the land that we used to do that with. The money comes in, the product is purchased from Big Ag. It goes to one of 2 warehouses in the country and then is shipped out to these remote locations where it's distributed to our people. It's not our food, but we have to, in the absence of good calories, we have to have calories. So it's not our food, so we take it. In the 2018 Farm Bill, we were able to successfully advocate for a pilot program to have those managed and purchased locally instead of coming from God knows where through these warehouses. So we're waiting for that pilot program to be implemented. That's another thing the Biden administration could do day one. FDIPers, buy your food from your producers. It's out there in the community. Another day one initiative, we need to have that CARES Act funding extended. There are a lot of tribes that are trying to do food system activities that would put the infrastructure to turn their commodities into food within their jurisdiction. But the timeframes within which they're to have that CARES Act funding spent is prohibitive. They're trying to fix the solution so that it doesn't happen the next pandemic or the next weather disaster, but the funding isn't out there long enough. It's going to get clawed back and redeployed through federal government processes at the end of the year. So we need to find ways to keep that capital out there in the system. But it all starts with tying back to that culture and bringing that education back at the local level, leveraging that knowledge that still exists at the local level into the management of these resources, and doing it in a way that doesn't pit us against our non-Indian friends and relatives that are out there. In my culture, and I'm not sure about Adae's, but when we pray, Mitakuye Oyasin, we are all related, is something that we say. And we don't say Mitakuye Oyasin Shni Washichu, we're all related but the white man. No, we don't say that. We are all related. And we have to find a way to get those folks that are managing the BLM lands right now to understand we are in the same boat. Mm-hmm. We are all victims of the system. And if we can get them to understand how they're part of the same system and how they're realizing the same adverse impacts, then we can get them on our side. And then we can maybe start talking about a bigger revolution, a bigger restorative revolution. Love that term. Thanks, Adae. I love the conversations that we get to have, this group. We should start our own podcast. We're way better than Joe Rogan.
And I'll just add my last 3 suggestions for the Farm Bill, the very quick 3. And one, I think right now there's a lot of interest in Indigenous practices and Indigenous people as having solutions, and I absolutely think we do, but it's nuanced because Indigenous people don't have traditional knowledge to address pesticide pollution. We don't have traditional knowledge to address urban sprawl. Some of these things that are happening in our world and contributing to environmental damage, we don't have traditional knowledge for. Some of that has to be part of mainstream society that they have to work on.
What, you're not going to fix it all by yourself? We can't just be here, fix it.
Yes. And so that's always to keep in mind, yes, we want to participate, but we're not here to reverse engineer the world's problems. And the second thing in the Farm Bill, it doesn't do well at like proposing or supporting collective ownership of things. Tribes have like collective ownership over our lands, but the Farm Bill proposes a lot of like individual solutions and individual supports for individual farms or individual land parcels. And you know, first we got to find ways to stick in ideas and support for collective ownership. And in general, outside of the Farm Bill, collective ownership models really have to be explored. They really have to be supported legally. And I think that's one of the key weaknesses of capitalism, is that it's so hyper individualized that it's damaging. Like this idea that we have collective resources, collective ownership of things is just not supported legally in our US legal system or really within the Farm Bill. And so if there are places, and you know, there are specific places where we could look at some of those ideas and at least support the idea of collective ownership of some of these resources, it's important. And the third one for me is, you know, Obama had the promise zones, right? Where they looked at communities that were high poverty and they sent an onslaught of federal agencies to those communities to try to improve the economic environments of those communities. We need a similar kind of action by people who manage land, by agencies that manage land, like not a promise zone for economic values or economic systems. We need like a promise zone for land managers, which would include like the Bureau of Land Management, the USDA, Bureau of Reclamation, Army Corps of Engineers. All of these federal agencies need to figure out how to create the promise zone concept for land managers. And so like we need that provision in the Farm Bill. There's some provisions that talk about co-management of lands, maybe with the US Forest Service, but that's not enough. Co-management still is very like ill-defined and still not like fully implemented. And even if we figure that part out, it's still going to leave out all these other federal agencies that have some stake in how certain land, especially tribal land bases, are managed. So we need that collective federal agency attention through some kind of like promise zone provision.
Folks, these are great ideas. Thanks for putting them out there. You know, the last question I'll have for you all also comes from one of our Nerds for Earth, actually, Lizzie, who you all met. And what she asked was, what's your message for young folks who really want to support action around climate change and regenerative agriculture and environmental justice and economic justice, you know, racial justice? So let's just go out on this note, which is for the youth. What do you have to say to them that they can pick up and carry forward, or you know, sit with in their own lives, or as activists, or as policy wonks?
That's a good question. I would say, don't be afraid to challenge conventional wisdom and embrace the native, the indigenous way of learning. We were oral traditional learners, and we can use technology now to support that. Imagine now, Adae, you and I can give lessons to our grandkids recorded here with Calla Rose that will outlast any pandemic. And what happened on this continent when Columbus came over is we lost the story. We lost the why behind the things that we were doing. We still knew what we did, but we didn't understand the hundreds of generations of research that went into it. So when we would get into a sweat lodge, we didn't realize that that was about inward looking purification and not necessarily all about a prayer to a creator. And now saunas are one of the big health movements because it helps reset your actual biological immune system. Fasting, my culture fasted. Most all of the indigenous cultures fasted. Look up autophagy and then think about fasting in terms of biological impact and expressing your epigenetics. Be a learner and don't just take what they give you in school, go beyond that and really try to understand the why beyond the things that we're doing.
I totally echo Zach's. I think that those same concepts came out to mind, and I would just say it a little bit differently. Like, one, Zach and I are up against a really well-oiled machine, right? Like, the Farm Bill has been in existence for how many cycles? That the way agriculture operates in our generation is pretty well oiled, sophisticated, and efficient, and it has its hold. But young people are coming in a new generation. And I think, like, if they are equipped with, as Zach said, the ability to challenge the conventional, which means like challenge the way we talk about colonization in America, challenge the idea that agriculture is a settler concept, that it like that wild Indians were colonized and the agriculturalists made farms and made America, like challenge that. There have been indigenous people on this continent practicing agriculture, and maybe not in the same ways we think of it as practiced in America today. Maybe it wasn't a square plot of land with a fence around it. Like, really learn about the history of this country and challenge the way we tell it in the school system. And from there, you know, maybe our food system will change because it's not rested on this idea that agriculture and the square plot with the fence is the answer to colonizing a wild landscape. Like, that concept needs to go, and it can only be challenged when we stop telling it in schools. And I think our young people, if they're equipped with the truth, will automatically challenge it, and not just like one off or two off people, like a whole generation can challenge that. And I hope I can bear witness to what that kind of challenge to that history brings.
Zach and Adae, thank you so much for your time. Just wanted to say, may we all bear witness to the breaking of the square with the fence, and may we all encourage curiosity and learning about the why and telling the good story. May those first day things all take place. First, second, third day. I'm cool with them taking place the fifth day. But let's just say thank you and blessings on your journeys. And I will see you again soon.
Thank you. One of the things that Adae alluded to earlier on in the discussion was how adept our people are culturally at these things.
Yeah.
And how quick we learn. And we're going to be all up in that Farm Bill this time. We got 64 provisions last time, and we were told to start from zero cost, no new programs. And we got 64. So we're getting this thing figured out, and we're going to get a bunch more, and we're going to revolutionize this thing. So I'm looking forward to the work we're going to get to do together in the next few years.